station where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
Two Tales of War.
Okay, I'm with a friend of the information, Nigel Furness, who has a very interesting story about his father, and this must have happened quite a few decades ago. So Nigel, how would you call this? Is it sort of an anecdote or a family story?
Well, it's a family story, it's a true story. I'm trying to work out as we sit here just what year this was, because my dad was born in 1907, and he married my mum at 33, and somewhere in between he was involved to an Austrian baroness by the name of Annie Hergesell. Now, he was a bit of a playboy, my dad. The family had money, and I never knew what he was doing in Germany, but he lived over there for quite some while, in Germany and Austria, primarily in Bavaria and that sort of area. And he was engaged to this woman called Annie Hergesell, and the fact is that this was in the early days of the Nazi Party. And the Nazis, Hitler, was no uncommon sight in Bavarian beer halls, or beer kellers as they called them, and was always jumping up on tables and ranting and pontificating. And my dad immediately recognised that there was the man was brilliant, said he, absolutely brilliant, but also extremely dangerous. And on one occasion, he always told us that he confronted Hitler and said that he was nothing other than a failed painter, and not a particularly good one at that. And all the entourage drew their pistols, and to my dad's horror, he had never realised Annie Hergesell, whom he'd been engaged to, was from a prominent Nazi family. And only that her brother happened to be, I don't know whether they were the Brown Shirts or SS, I really don't know, whatever they were. And they all drew their pistols, and he said, "Don't be so stupid, put them away," and took Dad to one side and said, "John, if you know what's good for you, you'll get out of this country within the next 24 hours or sooner and never come back." And he did. So, you know, and he came over, and the family were living then in Peacehaven, and there was one little store, and it was like something out of the Wild West, Peacehaven in those days. It would have been the late 20s or the very early 30s.
Peacehaven was only built into war, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And it was in its infancy, and they had this one store. It had the obligatory petrol pump outside. It was like a grocer's general store. It had post office, and it was also a cafe. There were no pubs, and so people always met up in that one place. And Dad was always preaching about this Hitler and saying he's going to cause another war unless we stop him. He's got to be stopped. There'll be another war. Now, the woman, I don't know what her name was, who ran the store, said, "There'll be no war, John." She had lost her husband in the First World War, and she had a son. She'd been pregnant when the husband was killed, and this son had been born called Tilly. And Dad got so annoyed on one occasion. "There'll be no war, John," said the proprietress. Dad said, "There'll be a war, and furthermore, Myra," I'm sure her name was Myra, it's come back to me, "your Tilly will be in it." Well, ironically, there was another war, and her son was killed in it. So that's basically it.
Was your dad quite fluent in German to be able to understand the language over there?
I never heard Dad talk German. The thing that puzzles me is Dad was, you know, in later life, very much a Germanophobic, because his father, my grandfather, had not only been in the Royal Army Medical Corps, but he was also a British agent. And the Germans, it's a very peculiar story, because Granddad was taken prisoner of war.
Yes,
he was in this camp and he got dysentery, and the Germans released him as an act of kindness. They thought he wouldn't live anyway. And at that very same time, Roger Casement and the Irish brigades were going over, trying to recruit British prisoners of war, particularly Irish ones, for the Irish side, because of course in 1916 there'd been the Easter Rising. And Grandad himself, who was Irish extract, and his wife, who was directly descended from the last clan chiefs, the British called them the Royal Family of Munster, I would sooner call them the clan chiefs, whose grandchildren have ended up 7/8 Irish like myself, was the man who brought Roger Casement to book. Now, you couldn't write the story, could you? You couldn't write the script. And how he did it, because he knew, being a surgeon, a doctor, that he would become delirious with the typhoid, and he wrote down Casement and the other names on a piece of paper, stitched them in the lining of his military cap, and when he got back he gave this to the whoever it was, the Home Office, Foreign Office, whoever was responsible, the War Ministry, it would be the War Ministry. And poor Roger Casement, of course, was apprehended in Bantry Bay and murdered by the British. So very, very strange that my dad would ever have gone to Germany, and this is something, unfortunately, when you're younger, you never think to ask the necessary questions, and then later in life you think, oh, I wish they were still here, so I could find out. There's nobody that could tell me what Dad was doing in Germany anyway. So, sadly...
Yeah, remains a matter of conjecture.
Very much so, but the only one thing we do know is that I found when Dad and Mum split up, I was sorting Dad's things, and the house had no electricity at the top, so I was working away after work every evening, you know, by candlelight, going through all these boxes. He always had these 3 rooms that were locked up. Nobody ever knew what was in the boxes. Well, among other things in the boxes that I found were bundles and bundles and bundles tied up with little red ribbon of love letters from this Annie Hergesell, and a number of them. How I wish you could see the child. The child is the image of you, so I obviously have a half sibling, or had, if they're still alive, either in Germany or in Austria, which I've just never got round to finding out about. Great shame that she never said what sex the child was, but there you are. I mentioned earlier that the Germans had killed my granddad, but I didn't explain how. Grandad was the commanding officer on a hospital boat bringing back the wounded, and the boat was called the Glenard Castle, and clearly painted with red crosses. And the Germans had realised Grandad had recovered, obviously by this time, from typhoid, and rather foolishly went back to the war effort. The Germans realised that Captain Furness was responsible for shopping Roger Casement and the Irish Brigades, and they put out a thing, get Furness at any cost. And they did, unfortunately, on the 26th of February 1918, quite near the end of the war. He was commanding the Glenard Castle, and as it came up the Bristol Channel, they sent out 2 U-boats right up the Bristol Channel, and both of them opened fire and torpedoed the ship. The ship went down in something like 2-3 minutes flat. I have no idea of the casualties. They were extremely high. A number of people were rescued and brought ashore at Swansea, as were the bodies. And Grandad could have been rescued, but insisted on going down with the ship, and was last seen standing to attention on the bridge of the ship, reason being that he was not prepared to desert the wounded down below decks, who of course would have had no chance of getting up onto the deck, far less into lifeboats or out into the water. And so it really sort of came full circle. It's a most peculiar story. But the other thing my grandmother always told me, and also my dad and my Uncle Reg, not Aunt Winnie, because she died aged 29, long before I was born, that at the instant, they didn't realise that until the next day, at the instant the ship went down, Grandma always said to me that she was having this weird dream about an old washerboard, the old zinc reached corrugated thing that women used to scrub washing on, and it was on a sharp angle, and it was tilting down to this deep cold water, and there were all these pigs squealing and scrabbling their hooves, scrabbling on it, trying to get out of the water. And she woke up from this dream and said, "Jim, what are you doing here?" And there was my grandfather in his full military regalia, stood by the dressing table, and he walked across the room and bent over the bed as if to kiss her, and disappeared. She thought, well, I must have been dreaming. When my dad, my Aunt Winnie, came running into the room screaming in a terrible state, they had seen exactly the same thing. Uncle Reg, the firstborn, was unfortunately illegitimate, as Grandad had been married before and my grandmother had been his medical secretary. They'd had an affair, and sadly in those days, the child was blamed for those circumstances. And poor Uncle Reg had woken up, and he had seen his father, but not in military regalia, as if he had a white shroud over him, like an angel, and it made him terrified, and he buried his head under the covers. Now, they can't all have been wrong, and Grandma says that she called the children together and said, "Your father's dead." She just knew it. and the following morning there was a knock on the door, and it was somebody from the War Ministry, and the exact time that that ship went down was when that happened. So there you are.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.